very Merry Christmas to you, friends. This is Art Baker in his notebook, and I really appreciate deeply the opportunity of being in your home for a few minutes this very important day. Now, I must tell you right here that when I thumb through my notebook for my favorite stories about Christmas, I find them listed under C, C-H-R-I-S-T-M-A-S, not under the X's, X-M-A-S. It goes back a good number of years to the time of my first Christmas away from home. And in sending my mother a Christmas gift, I bought a cute little card, and I wrote on it, Merry Xmas to the dearest of mothers. My mother wrote and thanked me for the remembrance, but she said, son, just because the world is in such a hurry, don't you ever get so rushed that you can't take time to write out the name of him whose birthday we celebrate. No more X's to your mother ever, please. So it's in the C's that I find a couple of stories that might fit in with your mood today. I'd like to tell them after this greeting. I have forgotten just where I heard this story in the first place. I think it was supposed to be a true story, and I think it also contains a powerful illustration of this thing that we call the real spirit of Christmas. That's the spirit of unselfish giving. It happens on this particular Christmas, long before the war. In a well-to-do residential district of a large American city, there was a contest for outdoor Christmas displays. And on the broad lawns of a great mansion, there had been carefully built a replica of the manger scene. Wax figures of the three shepherds were outlined by giant spotlights, and real live sheep grazed peacefully on the lawn. And in the manger, a life-size doll represented the figure of Jesus, the Christ child. Very beautiful. Thousands of persons from miles around flocked to see it. And special runways were erected across the lawn so that they could pass from one scene to another without destroying the grass, don't you know? Now, some of the club women of the neighborhood took turns acting as hostesses, answering questions. Oh, questions such as how much the whole thing had cost to reproduce, how much it cost each hour to burn the lights, and where the sheep had come from, and how much they had cost. You know, American questions. The scene was erected a couple of weeks before Christmas. I have no idea how many flocked to see it in the evenings after the lights were turned on. But then came Christmas morning, and one of the ladies from the mansion glanced out and saw the figure of a tiny, ragged urchin climbing up the side of the manger and lifting up the large and beautiful doll that represented the figure of Jesus. The urchin was apparently trying to conceal the doll in a filthy, ragged sweater. And horrified, the woman ran into the yard, screaming at the child to put down that doll, threatening to call the police. The stealing of a doll would be bad enough, but there seemed something particularly sordid in this attempt to make off with a doll that was supposed to represent the Christ child. The woman's eyes were hard and cold as she commenced to lecture the ragged little girl. Don't you know who that doll is supposed to be, she demanded. Don't you know that it's wrong to steal? And the child sobbed, but blurted out her denial. She wasn't trying to steal the doll. Then she told the whole pathetic little story. Yes, she had heard of the Christ child, Jesus, who was born in the manger in Bethlehem. Yes. And she had come each night for 2 weeks to stand beside that manger and shiver and gaze at the figure of Jesus lying there so still and sweet and peaceful, while others came to look and walked away. And she had thought to herself how cold he must be, lying there without any clothes on at all. And sometime during the night, on Christmas Eve, she explained, Santa Claus had come to her house and brought her just one gift. It was a sweater. A little too large for her, a little too long in the sleeves. It was patched in a few places and ragged in others, but it was all hers, and it was fluffy, and it was warm. And when she awakened early on Christmas morning and found that gift, she had realized that Santa Claus had somehow understood. He had brought her the one thing she had wanted more than anything else in the world, something warm and woolly that she could take to that manger and wrap about the cold, still figure of Jesus. She hadn't even lifted it from the manger. She had merely climbed up so she could gently lift that cold, still form and wrap her sweater about it. And that Christmas night, additional thousands came to view the manger scene. And in the manger they saw the tiny figure of the Christ child carefully wrapped in a dirty, ragged sweater. They didn't ask questions about this at all. They assumed that it was part of the symbol of Christmas. And they weren't too familiar with the story of the manger scene anyhow. Perhaps Christ had been wrapped in a sweater, a ragged sweater provided by someone who loved him very much. But as happens so often, a great lesson had come from the heart of a child. And a wealthy family had learned the true spirit of Christmas, of giving unselfishly. That happens to be one of my favorites. I'll turn the page of the notebook here for a couple of other yarns after this message. I can't really label this a yarn here. It's about traditions. I find that not all folks are entirely of one mind as concern Christmas traditions. I mean, there are those who go in for cute little pink or blue calcimine-coated Christmas trees. There are others who prefer nature in the raw. And each, I'm sure, stares pityingly at the other. And there are those who believe that family gifts should be opened Christmas Eve, and those who insist all gifts should be left untouched until Christmas morning. It's a sad start for any young marriage when the husband was raised one way and the wife the other, you know. I've heard of men who've been married more than 50 years reluctantly opening their gifts on Christmas Eve while sputtering, "I still say this sort of thing doesn't seem like Christmas." But I imagine the most inconsistency of all centers around the question of Christmas dinner, where the traditions are pretty much catch as catch can, and there's no official rule book. I know of families that invariably have Christmas dinner on Christmas Eve, so that the family can nibble leftovers on Christmas Day and Mama can be left more free from the kitchen. On the other hand, there are just as many or even more folks who would insist that Christmas Day wouldn't be Christmas without a big Christmas dinner and the whole family gathered around the table. And, of course, there's that compact little minority that observes Newmas, a rip-snorting banquet along about December 28th, who observe both New Year's and Christmas, sort of killing one bird with two stones. Even the menu for Christmas dinner has developed into a bit of hodgepodge here in our country, with a few traditions splashing over from Thanksgiving and others ad-libbed on the spur of the moment in view of a warped family budget. Over in England, I understand, the goose is pretty universally regarded as the appropriate Christmas fowl, just as the turkey's become significant of Thanksgiving here. Only once in my adult life have we gotten up the courage to attempt this English version. It wasn't too successful. Somehow, when the oven door was closed, the goose transformed itself into a pint-sized partridge, and dinner turned out highly vegetarian. The man at our meat market tells me there is no par for the course so far as Christmas dinner is concerned. He sells turkeys, chickens, ducks, and geese, legs of pork, ham, steaks, even hot dogs, just whatever you prefer. I asked him his personal preference, Finn and Hattie. Through the years, I guess we've tried practically every fowl that has ever grown, with the possible exception of the duck-bill platypus. And our one unvarying tradition of Christmas dinner boils down to plum pudding. Each year, without exception, my good wife gets it all prepared and heats up a beautiful plum pudding. And each year, without exception also, after the main course is disposed of, there come the apologies from around the table. I guess I'll have my pudding later. I'm just too full right now. Well, naturally, it wouldn't seem like Christmas if we didn't have the plum pudding. Only nobody ever eats it. And thus, some years ago, my good wife grew a little smart. She bought a plum pudding in a can. And each Christmas, she drops the can into boiling water and lets it simmer on the back of the stove. And after the meal is over, after everybody has declared himself couldn't eat another bite, she cools off the can and she puts it back in the cupboard on the shelf and save it for next year. It's gotten to be a regular ritual. As a family, we're not too touchy about Christmas dinner. We have only one cherished tradition. It just wouldn't seem like Christmas dinner if we didn't have a plum pudding. And I'm reasonably sure we always will have, unless the repeated heating process eventually eats away the tin. I merely stuck that in here in case you have the same trouble at your house. When Johann Heinrich von Dannecker, the German sculptor, had almost completed his statue of Christ, he called a little girl into his studio and pointing to the figure, he said, "Who is that?" And the child said, "Oh, some great person." And the artist turned away, disheartened. "I've failed," he said. "I'll begin all over." He did, and after 2 years of patient labor, he once again brought the little maiden before the statue. "Who is it now?" he said. And after a long silent gaze, she lowered her eyes in adoration and said, "Why, that suffer little children to come unto me." And the sculptor was satisfied. I found someplace a description of the person of him for whom we set aside this day. This is alleged to be derived from an ancient manuscript sent by Publius Lentulus, president of Judea, to the Senate of Rome. There lives at this time in Judea a man of singular character whose name is Jesus Christ. The barbarians esteem him as their prophet, but his followers adore him as the immediate offspring of the immortal God. He is endowed with such unparalleled virtue as to call back the dead from their graves and to heal every kind of disease with a word or a touch. His person is tall and elegantly shaped, his aspect amiable and reverend. His hair flows in those beauteous shades which no united colors can match, falling in graceful curls below his ears, agreeably couching on his shoulders, and parting on the crown of his head. His dress, that of the sect of Nazarites. His forehead is smooth and large, his cheeks without blemish and of roseate hue. His nose and mouth are formed with exquisite symmetry. His beard is thick and suitable to the hair on his head, reaching a little below his chin and parting in the middle below. His eyes are clear, bright, and serene. He rebukes with mildness and invokes with the most tender and persuasive language. His whole address, whether in word or deed, being elegantly grave and strictly characteristic of so exalted a being. No man has seen him laugh, but the whole world beholds him weep frequently, and so persuasive are his tears that the whole multitude cannot withhold their tears from joining in sympathy with him. He is moderate, temperate, and wise. In short, whatever the phenomenon may turn out in the end, he seems at present to be a man of excellent beauty and divine perfection, every way surpassing man. I just felt that I knew him a little better after reading that description. Thanks for having me in your home for this brief visit. From the Baker family to yours, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.